Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The year the harmattan refused to settle, ABA felt like a furnace with a heartbeat, and Icum and Nneni moved through it like two small birds sheltering under one leaf, always together, never far from the wind. He rose before the first Kiki trundled past Engwa Road, walking to the timber yard with a bag of nails and stubborn hope, returning each dusk with sawdust clinging to his shirt like second skin, and the smell of pine following him home like a prayer. She sold Gary and palm oil in his Ayaku market, her belly round as an early moon, her laughter still the kind that snagged on the corners of a day and refused to let it darken. When they counted their blessings, they counted each other twice, because everything else was an empty plate turned upside down, an unpaid rent whispered about, a landlord who cleared his throat like a judge. They patched leaks with nylon bags, cooked with broken spoons, and shared food the way children share secrets, tilting the plate so the other could chase the last grain. In the evenings, when ABA's heat gave way to a softer breath, they sat by their single window, talking of futures like cities on maps they could almost touch. One day Enugu for better work. One day Onitsha, to see the river light itself like a ribbon of silver. One day Owerri, to take their child to ride a carousel the way people do in films. When the baby moved, Nneni rested her palm and smiled at a place only mothers can see, telling the child of markets and music and a father whose hands, though rough, were gentle enough to make dreams. Icum kissed her knuckles and spoke in small promises that sounded bigger in the dark, the kind that make a woman plant her feet, even when the storm is coming. The neighbors laughed sometimes at their stubborn kindness, the way two people could be this broke and still pass rice to a hungry boy next door, and some nights, when the power cut and the whole street hummed with generators like angry bees, Nneni sang low, and Icum tapped rhythm on the table, and for a few minutes, poverty was a stray dog kept outside the door, no more no less. On the morning everything unraveled, the market's voice rose like a choir, and the world smelled of ripe tomatoes, engine oil, and sun-baked dust, a perfume only ABA could mix. Nneni balanced a basin of yam on her head, a small miracle wrapped in a blue wrapper, one palm steadying her load, the other rubbing slow circles on her back where the baby pressed as if impatient for daylight. Women called to her, "Nneni, how is the child?" And she smiled, the kind that shows even the tired parts of the day are still teachable. She bargained like a river nagging a stone, soft, steady, never giving up, keeping half an eye on the sky, which threatened rain the way a stingy uncle promises money he doesn't have. Somewhere near the stall where a woman sold cola nuts and gossip, voices rose like goats tied too close. She turned because every market woman knows the pitch of trouble, that sharp edge that slices through ordinary noise. She saw them before she understood them. Icum standing with his hands open like a man explaining a broken glass he hadn't dropped, and a broad-chested man called Odogwu, whose name had traveled through the market in the same breath as proud, quick-tempered, and don't look at him too long. Words flew, and some of them had teeth. She quickened her steps, wobbling through sacks of beans and buckets of pepper, the basin cutting into her scalp like a thin blade, her breath turning into small coins she could not spend fast enough. A child squealed somewhere. A tin cup fell, rolling under a table. Someone clapped with the excitement of people who did not know how quickly blood becomes rumor. The space around the men opened, the way a crowd becomes a ring without anyone deciding, and the market held its breath in that way a place remembers it has a heart. Odogwu shoved first, a careless push, and Icum stumbled, grabbing a post to catch himself, his shirt tearing at the shoulder. Nneni said his name, once, twice, but the syllables were swallowed by heat and pride. Then, like a pot that boils over because someone forgot to lift the lid, the air snapped. A fist, a short shout, the thud of bone against bone, the slap of sandal against sand, and the day unraveled faster than cloth in a careless hand. She did not think. Thinking is slow, and fear is a horse without reins. The basin tipped, yams tumbling like white stones, and she reached for the nearest stick, a length of wood resting by a stall, the kind used to prop a canopy when the sun is wicked. She saw Icum on one knee, a smear of dust on his cheek, his mouth open with a word that never finished, and she saw Odogwu's arm swing again, a heavy arc, a promise of more pain. The stick rose in her hand as if it had always lived there, and her body remembered 1,000 little injuries from a hard life and turned them all into one muscle. She swung once, the wood biting air with a whistle, then skull with a sound that lives under skin. Silence fell the way a bell stops ringing and leaves a hole behind. Odegwa's eyes widened like lanterns with dying wicks, and he took a step backward that had no ground in it. He folded in a way large men never practice, a tree cut with one clean stroke, and the market lost its language, became a place of open mouths, tilting heads, a woman's hand over her chest, a child's question dying unsaid. The stick dropped from her hand, suddenly heavy, suddenly wicked, and her fingers felt like strangers. Eneni's breath came in small, frightened bursts, and the braided hair at her neck prickled as if a warning had arrived too late. Icum rose, slow, careful, touching his head as if the pain might shatter under his palm, and looked at her with a gaze that held two worlds, gratitude like water, fear like fire. The first shout came from somewhere near the tomatoes. He is not moving. And then the second, older, meaner, blood. The market learned a new song, a high, thin keening that peels good sense off a crowd. Someone reached for Odegwa's wrist and let it fall. Eneni felt the baby turn, a hard roll that sent a line of pain up her side, and she whispered, please, to nothing in particular. Icum's hand found hers, and the warmth was anchor and flame both, and in one look, they built and broke 1,000 plans. Run, stay, speak, swallow, call, pray. Blue uniforms appeared as if the sun had summoned them, and the smell of boots and authority spread like kerosene, quick and unforgiving. Eneni tried to step forward, but Icum's fingers tightened, and in his voice she heard a door close softly. You did not see. You were not here. That night, in a cell that smelled of rust, stale sweat, and the last words men don't get to finish, Icum signed his name on a paper that bent the world out of shape, and he did it with a face that knew the price, yet paid without haggling. They asked their questions the way a hook asks a fish, sharp, patient, certain of the ending. He said the fight broke like bad lightning, that his anger had run ahead of him, that the stick found its way from ground to hand, and the man fell, and there were no other hands between. He built a story that sheltered her the way an umbrella shields two people poorly but better than nothing, and when they turned to Eneni, he shook his head, a small gesture that moved mountains. Outside, the night rain came like relief and ridicule at once, washing ABA's streets clean of dust and leaving the stains that matter, the ones under the ribs, untouched. When morning came, they moved him in a van that rattled like an old cough, past boys kicking a punctured ball, past women waiting for bread that would be late again, past the corner where they once promised to buy a fan when life stood upright. In Enugu, the courthouse climbed the sky with pillars that pretended to be fairer than men, and inside, words wore uniforms. Your lordship, Exhibit A, section this and that. The lawyers spoke as if words could undo time, but time sat with folded arms, unimpressed. Eneni's feet swelled in her slippers, her child kicking like a drummer with bad timing, and she held her wrapper tight, breathing in fours, then threes, then anything that kept tears from turning her eyes to salt. When the man in the flowing robe adjusted his glasses and said life imprisonment, the syllables marched like soldiers through the room and lined up in her throat, refusing to let air pass. Tick-tick went the clock. Talk-talk went her heart. She saw Icum turn, not far, not close, a man framed by iron and principle, and he gave her a smile that was not a smile, a small lifting at the corner of his mouth that meant, look at me, I am still here, even if they put me in a box. Outside, Enugu's afternoon smelled of roasted corn and rain on hot tar, and the city moved on, because cities do, while her world lost its corners and became a round thing she could not hold. She walked to the park like someone balancing grief on her head, bought a seat on a bus to ABA with money that should have bought diapers, and as the bus coughed and lurched and found the road, she pressed her palm to her belly and told the child the kind of truth that keeps people standing. We will eat somehow. We will breathe again. We will find morning where others find night. The road stretched like a thin promise between hills and stories, and in every pothole she felt the echo of a gavel, and in every streetlight the stubborn flicker of a future that refused to die. When the child arrived, it was not with the soft cry of the films or the gentle sighs the old women promised her. It was a sharp wail that split the air in the room at ABA General Hospital, slicing through the smell of disinfectant, palm oil, and rain on the zinc roof. Eneni lay on the thin bed, sweat cooling too fast on her skin, her chest rising and falling as if the whole act of breathing was a stubborn thing she had to convince her body to do. The midwife wrapped the baby in a cloth that had seen better years and pressed her into Eneni's arms. Her fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from the strange weight of something she had dreamed about yet feared to hold. She whispered a name, Amara, because the child needed to carry something beautiful in a world already rusted at the edges. Outside, thunder rolled over ABA like a slow drumbeat, and somewhere far away, a bus honked 3 times, the way drivers do when they want the road to remember them. The women who had helped her deliver hummed softly, a tune without words, the kind sung in kitchens while soup thickens and secrets settle. But when the hum faded, silence moved in, and the empty space beside her bed felt like a wound. She imagined Icum in his prison cell in Owerri, maybe lying on his back staring at the iron lines in the ceiling, unaware that at this exact moment, his daughter was staring into the world with eyes still fogged by first sight. The nurse brought pap and told her to eat. She obeyed, though each swallow felt like it fell into a pit. Her body ached from labor, but it was the absence beside her that made the ache unbearable. As she fed the baby that night, her eyes stayed fixed on the corner of the room where the wall met the ceiling, as if answers could grow there like cobwebs. The rain kept falling, each drop a small knock on the zinc, each knock a reminder that somewhere out there, he was counting different sounds, keys, footsteps, metal on metal. She whispered to the baby again, promising her a kind of protection she did not yet know how to give. By the second week, she had learned the peculiar language of hunger and exhaustion. Amara's cries were not all the same. Some were short bursts, like she was angry at being left too long. Others were low, drawn-out notes that meant she was searching for something warm and close. The days folded into each other, marked only by the changes in the light through her small window and the market noise drifting from afar. ABA was a city that refused to slow down for anyone's grief. The bus conductors still shouted their destinations. Brass, Milverton, Ogbor Hill. With voices rough as gravel, traders still argued over 1 naira changes, and tailors still promised dresses by Thursday that would come the following Tuesday. And Annie tied Amara to her back with the bright wrapper Icum had bought her 2 birthdays ago, the colors faded but stubborn, and made her way to the market. She sold small measures of groundnut and sachets of pure water, earning enough to buy bread, soap, and sometimes fish if the day had mercy. The stall was a wooden table under a patched umbrella, and by midday her feet would swell inside her slippers, the sun licking the back of her neck like a warning. At night, she would sit by the kerosene lamp, folding the day into memory while Amara slept beside her. Sometimes, in the quiet, she would talk to Icum in her mind, telling him what the baby did that day, what she ate, how she laughed when a boy in the next compound made faces through the window. But those conversations always ended with the same weight pressing on her chest. He could not hear her, and she had no idea when, or if, he ever would. In those moments, the walls of her room felt like they leaned closer, listening too much, knowing too much. The first time she decided to take Amara to a Owerri prison, it was a Monday morning washed in harmattan dust, the air smelling faintly of burning refuse and diesel fumes. She wrapped extra clothes for the child, a flask of hot water, and a packet of biscuits for Icum, though she knew biscuits would not fill the kind of hunger prison gave a man. The bus ride was long, with bumps that rattled her teeth, and Amara cried halfway through, drawing glances from other passengers. She looked out at the passing towns, Umuahia with its old colonial buildings, Baitoli with children running barefoot along the roadside, thinking how small and yet endless the road felt when the person you were going to see lived behind bars. At the prison gates, she handed over her small bag for inspection and waited in a sunlit courtyard where shadows clung to the edges like scared animals. When they brought Icum out, her throat locked. He was thinner, his shoulders sharper, but his eyes were still the same, searching, tired, and lit with that quiet warmth he never used for anyone else. He reached for Amara first, his fingers trembling as if they had forgotten the weight of softness. He pressed his lips to her head, inhaling like he could store the smell for later, and when he looked up at Nne, no words came. They sat together under a tree in the yard, speaking in pieces, because guards drifted by like drifting clouds, never far enough not to hear. She told him the child was healthy, that she was already strong, that she smiled when music played on the radio. He told her the days were long but survivable, that the nights were the worst because they had too much space for thinking. When the guard signaled it was time, he held the baby for one last heartbeat, then passed her back as though letting go cost him a limb. On the bus ride home, Nne stared out the window, the road a blur, her heart heavier than the bag on her lap. Weeks blurred into months, and the visits to Owerri became the thread holding her together. She timed her sales at the market, so she could save just enough for transport, cutting her own meals so Amara could eat more. The child grew, her first tooth showing like a small pearl, her laugh carrying in the courtyard like a blessing she did not yet understand she was giving. But the house was a small ship on a rough sea, rent always threatening, food always measured too carefully, and the nights colder than they should be. Some evenings she would sit outside on a low stool, shelling groundnuts while Amara crawled nearby, and watch people pass, men carrying baskets of vegetables, women balancing trays of fried plantain, school children in uniforms frayed at the edges. The world moved around her, and she felt like a rock in a river, the water rushing by but never carrying her forward. That was when she first noticed Winter, a man with the kind of gait that made you think he had nothing to hurry for. He stopped by her stall one afternoon when the sky was threatening rain, offering to help her lift a sack of beans. She thanked him politely, thinking nothing of it, but he returned the next day, and the next, sometimes buying water, sometimes just greeting her. His kindness was not loud. It was in the way he carried Amara when her arms ached, in the way he brought bread when he knew her coins would be gone before evening, in the way he never asked too many questions. Yet she kept her heart folded tight, because she had learned that love without caution was a door left open in the rain. Still, in the quiet corners of her days, she began to notice his absence when he did not come. Winter's presence in her life began as the kind of thing you barely notice, like a shadow under a tree, or the hum of a distant generator you only hear when it stops. But over time, it became something her days measured themselves by. He was not loud about his intentions, and that made him more difficult to refuse. There was no pressure, only an unbroken stream of small kindnesses that found her at the exact moments she needed them most. If the rain trapped her under the market shed, Winter would appear, holding an umbrella patched with tape, but still determined to keep the wet out. When Amara caught a fever that lasted 2 days, he walked the length of ABA to buy medicine, returning with sweat soaking the collar of his shirt and a stubborn smile on his lips. She told herself this was gratitude, not affection, because affection was dangerous when your heart was already promised to a man whose days were counted by the slamming of prison gates. But she found herself pausing to look for his figure in the distance each afternoon, scanning faces with the quiet hunger of someone waiting for a letter that might never come. ABA had a way of swallowing time. The days were full of noise, bargaining voices, and clattering metal pots, but the hours after sundown carried a different tone. He would sometimes walk her home, his steps slow to match hers, and talk about little things. The price of beans this week, the new preacher shouting at the bus stop, the rumors of a trader moving to Enugu. He never asked about Icum, and that silence was a mercy she did not take lightly. When they reached her compound, he would wave and leave without waiting to be invited in, as though he understood some lines were not meant to be crossed too quickly. Yet, on nights when the lamp burned low and the air pressed close, she would hear Amara breathing softly beside her, and wonder what it might mean to let that line blur. It was Mom and Ketchy who sharpened the air around them, her disapproval carried like a banner, even when she did not speak it aloud. Eneni first met her on a day thick with heat, when the air above the road shimmered, and the flies seemed slower in their circles. Winter had brought her a bag of rice, and while they were talking in the shade, Mom and Ketchy appeared from the path, her wrapper tied tight, and her headscarf arranged with the precision of a woman who believed appearances were half the truth. Her eyes lingered on Eneni's baby first, then climbed slowly to Eneni's face, and in that long, unblinking look, Eneni understood she had already been weighed and found wanting. The older woman greeted her politely enough, but her voice carried an edge that made the pleasantry feel like a formality only the day's manners demanded. Later, she would hear from a neighbor that Mom and Ketchy had spoken plainly in the women's meeting. "My son will not carry another man's baggage, no matter how sweet the smile or soft the voice." These words found their way to Eneni's ears not like a whisper, but like a knock, firm, undeniable, impossible to pretend away. Still, Winter continued to come, and if he knew of his mother's opinion, he gave no sign of it. Eneni kept her distance, careful not to create more friction, but friction has a way of building even in silence. Once, on a rainy evening when Winter had helped her carry firewood inside, Mom and Ketchy arrived unannounced, the look on her face somewhere between suspicion and confirmation. She did not stay long, only long enough to glance from Eneni to her son and back again, as though she were making mental notes for a ledger only she would ever see. The change began quietly, the way harmattan mornings shift without warning into dry, scorching afternoons. Mom and Ketchy fell ill in late August, a fever that kept her in bed and turned her voice hoarse. Winter, stretched thin between his work and caring for her, mentioned it in passing to Eneni one market day, and before she could think of reasons not to, Eneni found herself walking the narrow path to Mama Nkechi's compound with a small pot of pepper soup balanced carefully in her hands. The older woman was lying on a low bed, the window half open to let in the cautious breeze, her eyes dull with fatigue. At first she made no move to greet Eneni, but she ate the soup slowly, the steam curling between them like a tentative truce. Over the days that followed, Eneni returned with food, washed clothes, and sometimes just sat in the room, fanning her while they listened to the far-off chatter of schoolchildren passing by. Illness has a way of softening edges, and Mama Nkechi's voice lost its bite, her thanks becoming more frequent. One afternoon, as Eneni was about to leave, she caught the older woman looking at her, not with approval exactly, but without the cold distance she had kept before. "You are strong," she said simply, as if the words had been waiting for the right day to be spoken. From then on, there was less steel in her glance, and when she passed Eneni in the market, she no longer pretended not to see her. Trust, Eneni knew, is not always born in grand gestures. Sometimes it begins in something as small as a bowl of soup eaten without complaint. When Winter asked her again to marry him, it was on an evening washed in the gold of a setting sun, the kind that makes even the rusted zinc roofs of ABA look almost holy. They were sitting outside her small room, Amara playing with a tin cup in the dust, the sound ringing like a bell each time it tipped over. He spoke without ceremony, his voice even but carrying a weight that made her heart pause. "I want to build with you, Eneni. Not just help. Not just visit. Build." She stared at him, her mind folding and unfolding the words, knowing what they meant and fearing them all the same. She thought of Icum, his face behind the wire, the way he had carried her crime as his own. She thought of the promise they had made without saying it out loud, the one that tied her to him even now. But she also thought of the nights she had cried into her pillow while Amara slept, the mornings she had stretched the last handful of Gary into a meal, the weight of doing everything alone. Winter's eyes were steady, his hand warm when he reached across the space between them. For a long moment she said nothing, and he did not rush her. Finally she nodded, a slow, careful nod, and something in the air shifted. Amara laughed just then, as if she knew a change had come, and the cup fell again, ringing once before settling in the dust. That night, when the lamps were lit in the compound and voices floated on the air like pieces of old songs, Eneni felt a kind of stillness she had not known in years, though she also felt the shadow of what had been left behind. The heart, she thought, was never a single room. It could hold more than one truth at once, and still beat. The years that followed her quiet acceptance of Winter's proposal folded themselves into the shape of a life she had almost forgotten how to dream about. The mornings began with the smell of boiling water for pap, Amara's sleepy voice asking questions about the day before the sun had fully risen, and Winter stepping into the yard with the easy gait of a man who had no need to hurry home because home was here now. They did not live in luxury. There was still the occasional day when the soup was thinner than they liked, or the rain found a path through the old zinc. But there was a comfort in knowing the weight was not hers alone to carry. The market still claimed much of her day, but the evenings were theirs. Small meals eaten with laughter, Amara chasing the chickens across the yard, Winter telling her the kind of stories that made ordinary hours swell with warmth. Mama Nkechi, once a stone wall, now treated her like a daughter, calling her to come taste soup or bring palm oil from the market. In those moments, Eneni would find herself watching the older woman's face, wondering if she ever thought about the first day they met, when disapproval had been thick as dust between them. If the guilt of Icum's absence gnawed at her, she did not let it rise to the surface often. She visited him less, first because the cost of travel bit deeper now that she was building a new home, and then because the visits seemed to open doors she no longer wanted to stand in. Letters from the prison came rarely, short notes with more silence than words, but she read each one and tucked it into a tin under her bed, as though paper could keep a promise alive without tearing. Life was steady, not without its shadows, but she had learned that sometimes steadiness was the most beautiful thing a person could have. The day Icum walked out of a wary prison, the city was moving at its usual restless pace, the roads coughing with buses and the air hanging heavy with the smell of fried akra. He had not told Eneni of his release. In truth, he had not told anyone except the prison warder, who handed him his small bag of belongings. A shirt 2 sizes too big, a pair of sandals with the leather worn thin, and a folded scrap of paper with an address written in careful handwriting. He went first to Nsukka, where his mother lived in a compound with walls painted the color of old clay. She cried when she saw him, holding his face in her palms like she could smooth the years away with her thumbs, but the joy in her eyes was tempered by something unspoken. Over a plate of yam and bitterleaf soup, she told him Eneni no longer came to visit, that she had remarried, that the child had grown. She hesitated before handing him the paper with the address, her fingers tightening on it as if she was not sure she should let go. He took it without argument, folded it into his pocket, and sat in silence for a long while after. That night, lying on a mat in his mother's room, he stared at the ceiling and thought of the day in the market when the stick had left his hands, but the weight had landed squarely on his back for years. He did not know what he expected to find at that address, anger, perhaps, or tears, but he knew he would go. The first knock came on a late morning in ABA, when the sun was just beginning to climb high enough to make the zinc hot under the palm. Amara was the one who opened the door, her hair in small plaits tied with red ribbons, her eyes curious. She saw a man she did not know standing there, his clothes clean but worn, his face lined like the bark of a tree that had seen many seasons. He asked for her mother in a voice low enough to make her hesitate before running inside. Eneni stepped out a moment later, a rag in her hand from cleaning the table, and the sight of him froze her mid-step. For a second, the air seemed to vanish between them. Then she shut the door, not with anger, but with the reflex of someone whose heart has been startled into hiding. Inside, she stood against the wall, her breath shallow, Amara tugging at her wrapper to ask who the man was. She did not answer. Outside, Icum waited a while, the sounds of the neighborhood passing around him like a stream around a rock, before turning to leave. 2 days later, he returned. She did not open the door, though she knew from the silence of his knock that he was not going away quickly. By the 4th day, the knock came again, but this time Winter was the one to answer. When the door swung open, the two men looked at each other with the cautious appraisal of strangers who both suspect they know too much. Icum spoke first, his words deliberate. "I am looking for my wife and my child." Winter's brows tightened, the line between his eyes deepening. "Your wife?" The words came out like a challenge. "Eneni is my wife. I have been raising that child since she could barely walk." Icum did not flinch. "You have been raising my child. I was not given the chance because I was behind bars for what she did. If I had not taken her place, she would be the one rotting there instead of me." The words landed heavy, and Winter's face shifted from suspicion to something more unsettled. Behind him, Eneni stood frozen, the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. She had never told Winter the truth, not the way Icum had just spoken it. In the thick pause that followed, Icum looked at the girl who had peered out days before, his eyes softening for the briefest moment, then hardening again as he turned back to Winter. "I came for her," he said simply, "and for my child." There was no shouting, no raised hands, only a stillness in the room that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Winter's jaw worked as though he wanted to speak, but found no words that would hold the weight of the truth just given. When Icum left that day, it was without his daughter, but with the kind of certainty that does not fade. Eneni knew then that this was not the end of his knocking. Winter could not sleep that night. The small kerosene lamp on the table burned with a stubborn flame, casting shadows that swayed across the walls like restless spirits. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor as though the answers he needed were hidden in the cracks of the cement. Eneni moved quietly in the room, putting Amara to sleep, avoiding his eyes. The child curled against her, her breath soft and steady, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond her dreams. When Eneni finally turned to face him, the look in his eyes made her skin prickle. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of something that could not be ignored. She knew exactly what he meant, yet her mouth stayed dry. "What did he tell you?" she asked in return, buying time she did not really have. Winter's gaze did not shift. "He told me he went to prison for you, that you were the one who killed that man in the market, that he took your place." The words filled the room like smoke, thick and impossible to breathe through. And then he sat down slowly, her hands twisting in her lap, the memories she had locked away rushing back with such force she felt the air leave her chest. She had never meant to keep it from him forever, but the longer she had stayed silent, the more impossible it had seemed to speak. "It's true," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I thought Icum was in danger. I didn't think." Winter stood abruptly, pacing the narrow space between the bed and the wall. "You didn't think? You let him carry that burden for years, while you started a new life here with me? Do you know what it feels like to look at you now, and wonder if I ever really knew you?" His words were sharp, but behind them was something deeper. Hurt, betrayal, a love that had been blindsided. and then he tried to reach for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. I have been raising that child like my own, and I have worked myself to the bone for her, for us, and now you tell me her father is alive, walking free, and wants her back. The lamp flickered, and in the silence that followed, the only sound was the distant bark of a stray dog. Annie's tears fell quietly, not for herself, but for the fragile thing between them that had just cracked. The days that followed were heavy, each one carrying a silence that felt colder than any words they might have exchanged. Winter went about his routines, going to the market, tending to his trade, but the warmth in his voice when he spoke to her was gone, replaced by the measured tone of someone holding themselves back. Annie tried to keep things normal for Amara, but the child was perceptive in ways children often are, and she began to ask why Papa no longer laughed at dinner or carried her on his shoulders when they went to fetch water. At night, Annie would lie awake beside her daughter, listening to Winter move restlessly in the other room, the sound of his footsteps pacing slow and deliberate. She knew he was wrestling with a decision, and she dreaded the shape it might take. On the fourth day after Icum's visit, Winter came home later than usual. He sat down without eating, his eyes fixed on the door as though waiting for someone to walk through it. When he finally spoke, his words were steady, but they pressed into her like stones. He's her father, Annie. I can't keep her from him. The air seemed to leave her lungs all at once. What are you saying? She asked, her voice catching. I'm saying he will take his child. I have no right to stop him. I have been here for years, yes, but blood is blood. Annie felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor had shifted beneath her. And me? She asked quietly. What about me? Winter's eyes met hers briefly before drifting away. You are free to stay here. But if he wants her, I won't fight him for her. It was the first time she truly understood that this wasn't just about Amara. It was about trust, and the space between them that had widened into something they might never bridge. Icum returned the next morning. The sun was already high, casting sharp light into the compound, and the air smelled faintly of roasted maize from the roadside. He stood at the doorway, his posture calm but unyielding. Amara was playing with a rag doll near the steps, and when she saw him, she tilted her head as though trying to place where she had seen his face before. And then he stepped outside, her heart thudding in her ears. Winter followed a moment later, standing slightly behind her, but close enough to signal his presence. Icum greeted them, his eyes moving first to Annie, then to the child, before resting on Winter. I came for her, he said simply, and I won't leave without her today. Annie opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Winter stepped forward, his voice even. She is yours by blood. I will not stand in your way. For a heartbeat, Annie thought she had misheard him. She turned sharply to face him, searching his face for any sign that this was a bluff, but all she found was quiet resolve. Icum crouched down, calling Amara by name. The child hesitated, looking to her mother for guidance. Annie knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her forehead. Go with him, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Amara clutched her doll tighter, but allowed Icum to lift her into his arms. He looked at Annie once more, a mix of gratitude and something she couldn't name, then turned and walked away. The sound of his footsteps faded slowly, leaving an emptiness that seemed to hum in the air. That night, Annie sat outside alone, the compound quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The space where Amara usually sat beside her was empty, the doll left behind on the low stool. She held it in her lap, her fingers tracing the frayed edges of its dress, the fabric still smelling faintly of the child's skin. Inside, Winter was silent, the kind of silence that comes when words have run out and only time can decide what happens next. Annie thought of the years she had spent holding everything together with her own two hands, of the man in Owerri who had carried her crime as his own, of the life she had tried to build here only to watch it shift under her feet. She wondered if Icum would raise Amara with stories about her mother, or if he would let the years of absence speak louder than any memory. The moon rose slowly, pale and thin, casting a soft light over the compound. Somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed, steady and unchanging, a sound she had always found comforting, but now seemed to mock the fragile stillness around her. She did not know what the next day would bring, whether Winter would still want her here, whether Icum would return again. But for the first time in a long while, she felt truly alone, as if every choice she had made had led her to this quiet place where even the air seemed to withhold its warmth. She held the doll tighter, the only piece of her daughter she could still touch, and stared into the darkness until her eyes blurred. The morning after Icum took Amara away began with an emptiness that seemed to stretch wider than the compound itself. The rooster crowed at the same time it always did. The neighbors carried their buckets to the well, and the street vendors began shouting the prices of their wares, but the rhythm of the day felt wrong in her chest. Annie sat on the small wooden stool just outside her room, her wrapper loosely tied, her eyes fixed on a spot in the sand where Amara used to draw crooked circles with a stick. The lines were still faintly visible, half washed away by the night's breeze, and she caught herself tracing them in her mind, remembering how her daughter's small hand would curl tightly around hers when she guided her fingers. The sun climbed slowly, its heat pressing against her skin, but she didn't move. Winter passed by twice without speaking, carrying a bucket first, then a bag of groundnuts, his face set like a wall. She wanted to ask him what he was thinking, whether he believed the right decision had been made, whether he felt the absence too, but the words didn't form. Instead, she listened to the noise of the compound, the splashing water from the well, the clatter of cooking pots, the faint laughter of children, and felt like a ghost moving among the living. She thought about walking to the roadside to see if she could catch sight of them, but she knew the road to Icom's place was far and tangled, and the sight might break something in her she would never mend. The day stretched long, every hour heavy, until the shadows grew long and the air cooled, yet still she remained seated, waiting for something she could not name. On the third day, she decided to go to the market early, more to keep herself from thinking than to make any real money. The path to her stall was lined with familiar faces, women selling plantain, men balancing crates of beer on their heads, children weaving between customers like small currents in a river, but she moved through them as though she were underwater. The voices around her felt distant, the smells of fried yam and pepper soup failing to pull her into the moment. She arranged her goods without looking at them, her mind wandering to what Amara might be doing at that exact moment. Whether she had eaten, whether she had asked for her, whether Icom had told her the truth about why they had been apart for so long. A customer came to buy water, and she handed it over with a smile that felt brittle. Midday came and passed, the heat settling on her shoulders like an extra weight, and she realized she had been staring at the same spot in the dust for too long. Winter arrived then, his steps slow, his shadow stretching before him. He did not stand close, but looked at her as though measuring whether to speak. "You should come home," he said simply. She searched his face for a sign of the man who used to sit by her in the evenings, but there was a distance in his eyes now, a quiet that had nothing to do with the bustle of the market. She gathered her things and followed him without a word, the two of them walking side by side, but feeling like strangers moving in the same direction for different reasons. When Icom returned a week later, it was not to bring Amara back but to speak to Nne. He arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already lowering toward the rooftops, casting a soft orange light over the compound. She was inside, sorting dried fish into a bowl, when his voice called her name from outside. Stepping out, she saw him standing near the gate, Amara absent this time. His eyes were calm but unreadable, the lines on his face deeper than she remembered. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them holding the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, he told her that Amara was adjusting well, that she was eating, laughing, and learning his routines. He didn't speak with pride or triumph, but with a matter-of-factness that made her chest tighten. "I know you love her," he said quietly, "and I will not keep her from you forever. But she needs to know me. She needs to know where she came from." And Nne nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the ground, afraid that if she met his gaze she would see herself reflected in a way she could not bear. He shifted slightly, glancing toward the street, then added, "I didn't come to take you. I know your heart belongs somewhere else now." The words were like a door closing gently but firmly, leaving no space for misunderstanding. She wanted to ask him if he ever regretted taking her place in prison, but the question lodged in her throat, unspoken. Instead, she simply told him to take care of their daughter, her voice low and steady. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared behind the bend in the road. That night, the compound seemed quieter than usual, as though even the air had decided to rest. And then he sat outside again, the doll still on the stool beside her, its fabric more worn now, the thread at its hem loosening. Winter was inside, his voice drifting faintly through the doorway as he spoke with someone she couldn't see. She thought about the years that had brought her here, the heat of that day in the market, the sharp sound of wood meeting bone, the long visits to the prison, the hesitant courtship with Winter, and finally the steady life that had been pierced by a single knock on the door. Her heart felt like a place with two roads running through it, neither of which could be closed completely. Somewhere in the darkness, a baby began to cry in another room, and she turned her head instinctively, only to be met with the reminder that the sound was not hers to answer anymore. She leaned back, looking up at the thin crescent of the moon, wondering if Amara might be looking at the same sky from wherever she was. The night breeze lifted the edge of her wrapper, carrying with it the faint smell of cooking fires and damp earth, and for the first time in days, she closed her eyes, letting the quiet settle. She didn't know if she would see her daughter in a week or a month, but she knew she would wait. In the waiting, there was pain, but there was also a kind of stubborn hope, the kind that refuses to die even when the past has taken so much. Life has a way of testing the strength of our hearts through storms we never prayed for. This story reminds us that truth, no matter how heavy, is easier to carry than the burden of secrets, and that love without honesty is like a house without a foundation. It may stand for a while, but the cracks will always find their way to the surface. So my advice to you listening right now is this: guard your choices, because they can shape not just your tomorrow, but the tomorrows of those you love. And never let pride or fear keep you from doing what is right, even when it costs you something dear. May your home never lack peace. May your love never be tested beyond what your heart can bear. May your hands never be too empty to give, and your eyes never too clouded to see the truth. May the ones you love be kept safe from harm, and may your life be full of honest joys that no one can take away. May every hidden pain be replaced with comfort, and may every silent prayer you've whispered in the dark be answered in the light. In your going out and your coming in, may blessings follow you like a shadow that never fades. If you believe it, let me hear you say, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.